moving on into our last. I'm actually going to print this page off so I can do a little doodling on it. All right, let's talk about the brain. And then at the end of the lecture, as promised, we will talk about those cranial nerves that I've referenced. All right, reading off here, solving an equation, feeling hungry, laughing. Those are things that we do on a daily basis, I'd say. Maybe we're not solving the Pythagorean theorem or doing super math related equations, but we're always adding and subtracting different things. Hopefully you're laughing, and I'm sure you all feel hungry on a daily basis. The neural processes needed for each of these activities occurs in different regions of our brain. We can describe our brain as a portion of our central nervous system contained within the cranium, and it's made up of about 85 billion neurons. So a heck of a lot of those functional neurons that we've previously learned about, and a heck of a lot more of those supporting cells, what we call neuroglia, 10 to 50 trillion of those. And that includes things like astrocytes and ependymal cells that we talked about in our first lecture before spring break. That's pretty amazing considering your brain is a very small structure as a whole, only a mass of about 1,300 grams or 3 pounds. Although we have a really big brain relative to our size. It seems small, but compared to other animals, we have a really big one. Okay? Our brain can be described as a control center for registering sensations, correlating them with one another and with stored information, as well as for things like making decisions and taking actions. It's also responsible for your intellect, your emotions, your behavior, and your ability to remember things, your memory. Okay, so everything we do, we can thank our brain for it. Okay, our brain has specific regions or divisions that each work to accomplish specific functions. That includes the brain stem, which is down at the bottom of the brain, just above your spinal cord. 3 major parts to the brain stem include the medulla oblongata, made famous by the 90s movie, The Water Boy, the pons, and then the midbrain. Okay, then posterior to your brain stem is the second largest part of your brain, what we call the cerebellum, not to be confused with the biggest part of our brain, what we call the cerebrum. There are a lot of similarities aside from just their names between your cerebellum and the cerebrum, and we'll find out all about that later in the lecture. And then above the brain stem, kind of at the base of the cerebrum, is what we call the diencephalon. That includes this big ball-like structure called the thalamus, this structure just below the thalamus called the hypothalamus, and then this kind of area here is what we call the epithalamus, which includes a gland called the pineal gland that we'll talk about later in the lecture. And then, like I said, the largest part of your brain, and this is what really separates us from other animals and makes us, able to do the fancy things like solving equations and, composing music and, doing things that other animals don't, comes courtesy of the cerebrum. Without a doubt, this image will be on your exam. I'm telling you that right now. It is a sagittal section. So in other words, the brain's been cut down the middle from front to back. And this is showing you the interior view of the brain. I printed it off, as I was just saying, because I want to add to it. And what you have here is absolutely stuff that you need to know, along with the following things. So let's add to it starting now. Now, most of these things are parts of the brain or parts of these different things. And you'll learn them later in the lecture. So they might have a fancy name that doesn't make any sense now, but it will later in this lecture at some point. Okay, first thing I want to do is just kind of break down the cerebrum into what we call its lobes, which are named for the bones that are on the outside. At the front of the brain is your frontal lobe, and that's going to be deep to the frontal bone, as we know. Deep to the parietal bones will be the parietal lobes. That's a P, not a D. Sorry, my handwriting's atrocious. And then in the back of the brain is your occipital lobes. We can see one of each of these, since this is only half the brain, it's been cut in half. And what we cannot see from this image, since it's an interior or medial view, is the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes would be on the outside of the lateral side of the brain, and that's not what we're viewing here, but we'll see an image later in the lecture that will give us a nice distinctive view of the temporal lobes. We also can't see other parts of the cerebrum, like what was called the insula, but we'll see that later on. This kind of big hook-like structure within the cerebrum, I'm going to highlight and label now, is what we call the cingulate gyrus. C-I-N-G-U-L-A-T-E, and then gyrus is G-Y-R-U-S. It looks like it's the big spoon, and the little spoon is this white structure here. It's actually made up of white matter. That's why it's colored white. And that is called the corpus callosum. C-O-R-P-U-S. Callosum is spelled C-A-L-L-O-S-U-M. Just inside of that, or deep to that, is a little piece of tissue we're going to talk about here in just a couple seconds. This is called the septum pellucidum. S-E-P-T-U-M, spell septum. Pellucidum is P-E-L-L-U-C-I-D-U-M. As you can see here, the midbrain is labeled as kind of two different things, and that's because there's like this canal that runs through it. This is a chamber where you find fluid. Okay, that fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, and we've talked about that before, but think of it like a river kind of running down the center of a city and splitting it in half. Okay, this channel is called the cerebral aqueduct, but it also goes by this term called the aqueduct of the midbrain. And we're going to talk about that along with the septum pellucidum, and then this little channel right here, right in front of the cerebellum, between it and the pons, which is called the fourth ventricle. And what we can actually see is just below that, you can see this tube here. If I go back to this picture here, there was this structure called the central canal that we talked about. That's what this is. So that's the central canal. Within the cerebellum, I want to highlight the white matter. It has a fun, fancy name, We will call that the arbor vitae. Arbor, A-R-B-O-R, vitae, V-I-T-A-E. Vitae or vitae, I can't remember the specific correct spell or pronunciation. It actually means tree of life. And that's because it looks like a tree. There might be a couple of things I'll add later, but we'll stop with this amount of stuff. Like I said, there is a 100% chance that you will see this on the exam. So make sure you know it. What we'll do going forward is run through each different region of the brain. We'll start at the bottom, going with the medulla, and then work eventually talking about the cerebrum last. Before we do that, here's a picture of essentially just what we saw on that previous page, a sagittally sectioned brain. This is a real cadaver brain. And like I said, it's just basically the exact same thing as what you see there. Pretty cool to see, you know, how the folded parts of the cerebrum and the cerebellum are. Very fat pons, which makes it very identifiable. Just above that's midbrain, just below that the medulla. Not everything's visible and quite as drastic as that illustration goes, but that's okay. You know, it's still cool to see the real deal whenever possible, at least in my opinion. And just like we started with protecting our spinal cord, I want to talk about how we protect our brain. And it's those three meninges that we previously learned about. The dura, and then the arachnoid and pia maters. Where these are going to be between the bones and, in this case, the brain. We saw these three different connective tissues around the spinal cord. Okay. In the case of these three layers are some kind of unique features. Okay. For example, the dura mater actually has two layers when surrounding our brain, the outer and the inner. The outer is the periosteal layer, the inner is the meningeal layer. And we can see them here in this illustration, which is looking at this kind of blue shaded box from a frontally sectioned brain and skull. So on the very outside is the skin, where the hair would be growing. Then deep to that would be the bone, in this case, the parietal bones. And then shaded green here, we can see two different things labeled, will be the dura mater. Okay, over here is essentially the exact same thing as what you see here, just from a cadaver, although it's impossible here to show that there are two layers to the dura mater. You can at least see where it's labeled. Notice there is no space between the dura mater and the cranial bones, which means that surrounding your brain is no epidural space. And remember, the epidural space was superficial to the dura mater around our spinal cord, and we talked about like getting an epidural injection. There is no epidural space in the case of the skull and your brain. Okay. What your dura mater also has that's unique, aside from those two layers, are what we call dural sinuses. These are channels within the dura mater that contain venous blood. So this is blood that's on its way back to your heart, okay, after it's traveled through the brain and supplied the brain with your, you know, much needed oxygen and glucose along with other things. And that blood is going to travel from these dural sinuses eventually to the internal jugular veins, which run down through your neck, and then eventually that's where the blood goes to your heart. Okay. We can see one of the many of these dural sinuses shown here in blue. Notice here the dura mater is shown green, and then we have this space here shaded blue. That's a space where you're going to find venous blood. Okay, it's not quite as perfectly triangular over here as it is there, but it is definitely visible. We can see some of those are also labeled down here at the bottom, like the inferior sagittal sinus. There's that same one we just saw, the superior sagittal sinus, transverse sinus. Those are all just going to help return blood back to your heart. Okay. Now, there's also three extensions of your dura mater that help separate your brain into its distinctive regions. Okay, what we call the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, the falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, both sound very similar, but are obviously very different. Cerebelli is associated with the cerebellum. Cerebri associated with the cerebrum. Okay, they both do essentially the same thing, and that's split the cerebrum and the cerebellum in half. Okay, the falx cerebri we can actually see right here in this illustration is what divides your cerebrum into its two, what we call hemispheres. Okay, we can see the two halves of your cerebrum very nicely here in this picture. You can also see them very nicely here and over here as well. Okay, the very thick colored white line here that's splitting them in half is the falx cerebri, okay, which labeled down here at the bottom, we can see it in our sagittally sectioned head. I do want you to highlight the falx cerebri here, not to be confused with the falx cerebri is the falx cerebelli, which I do want you to highlight down here at the bottom. Does the same thing, except it divides the cerebellum into its two hemispheres. Okay, so the falx cerebri separates the two cerebral hemispheres, falx cerebelli separates the two cerebellar hemispheres. The tentorium cerebelli is what separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and essentially would be going right through this little crevice right here. Okay, and that's what keeps the cerebrum and the cerebellum separated from one another. Also visible down here at the bottom, labeled right there, which I do want you to highlight. So in this image at the bottom, there's only three things: the falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, falx cerebelli, that I want you to know. Okay. So those are all, once again, extensions of the dura mater, helping to kind of break your brain up into its different parts. Okay. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. It is the middle layer. Associated with it are little specialized structures called arachnoid villi, which if I zoom in, you can kind of see. The arachnoid mater in our illustration here is shaded pink. And we see these things that always look like little Christmas trees to me. These little projections of the arachnoid mater come into those sinuses. Okay, and their job is to protrude through the dura mater into those sinuses and transport cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space to the dural sinuses. So in other words, they help get fluid from where it is in the big subarachnoid space back into the blood. And you'll see that here on the next slide when we talk more about circulating cerebrospinal fluid, that you always have to remember fluid in our bodies flowing like a river. It's not staying stagnant. So in those places like in our brain, that fluid that will be in that subarachnoid space isn't going to just stay put in there. Okay. Now that subarachnoid space here in our illustration is very pronounced. It's quite a bit bigger than what we saw around the spinal cord. Here it's very visible. If you guys remember, we learned that the arachnoid mater gets its name because it kind of looks like spider web. Arachnoid for arachnids, which is what a fancy term for spider means. And you kind of see why they might give it that spider web description. And that's due to the collagen and elastic fibers that are associated with the arachnoid mater. Okay. And then finally, the pia mater is going to tightly cover the brain and function to carry blood vessels that nourish it. Okay. It in this illustration is shaded red. Okay. And as you can see, is directly connected to the brain, which is very similar to what we learned around your spinal cord. Okay. As far as this image, I do actually want you to know it. Pretty much everything on the left side, I would say fair game. On the right side, just the three meninges that are labeled. So the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. You don't need to worry about the sinus, the skin, the parietal bone, or the cortex. Although we'll talk about that, but I'm not worried about it quite yet. All right. Moving on. All right, cerebrospinal fluid. Think back to before spring break, we learned is a fluid located in the subarachnoid space. It's also found within cavities and canals of our brain and spinal cord. In fact, we labeled some of those back on that first page, like this one here, and that central canal down there in the spinal cord. Okay. We learned back in our very first lecture of this unit, like I said, it feels like it's been months. It is formed by what we call ependymal cells. Okay. It is a clear colorless liquid containing glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, cations, anions, and some white blood cells. So there's just a lot of different stuff. Some of it's nutrients, lactic acid, urea. Those are waste products, okay, that we're going to try to get away from the brain. In our ventricles, the chambers within our brain, its job is to help absorb physical shocks to the brain. So it's going to help prevent, like, concussion. It's going to distribute nutrient materials to and remove waste from our nervous tissue, and it provides a chemically stable environment. Okay, very closely associated with our cerebrospinal fluid is the blood-brain barrier, which we also talked about in our first lecture, formed by astrocytes. It's a separation of blood plasma from capillaries and the cerebrospinal fluid in our ventricles. Okay, in our brain we have 4 ventricles, which is actually just like what we have in our heart. Think of these as like chambers. In our heart, we have 2 atria, which are the upper chambers, and then at the bottom of the heart are 2 ventricles, which is probably where, if you've ever heard the term ventricles, that's what you've probably heard of would be your left and right ventricle of your heart. Okay, but our brain has 4 ventricles as well. Okay, in our illustration here, we're looking at a right lateral view of the brain as it's labeled. I want you to keep in mind that these are obviously not going to be visible from the surface. Okay, these are almost like the innermost parts of the brain where you'd find them. Okay, and so that's why they've kind of shaded them transparently to kind of just illustrate where they'd be at in the brain. If we look down here at the bottom, we've got 2 different cadaver views. When we're basically the top of the brain's been cut off, that gives you a good view of a couple of them here in I believe this will be a frontally section brain. So the front of the brain's been cut off, which always to me looks like somebody screaming. We can see 3 of those 4. So what are those 4 ventricles? Well, the first 2 are called lateral ventricles. Okay, there's one located in each hemisphere of our cerebrum. They are separated by a thin membrane known as the septum pellucidum. Okay, they're shaded here in blue. They kind of have this C shape with a little kind of a fancy tail on the end of them. Go ahead and highlight the lateral ventricles. They're labeled in this image. If you look down at these 2 images at the bottom, that's what we are showing here, as well as right here. Okay, and then I really like both of these images at the bottom because they show the septum pellucidum, which is one of the things I had you label on that first page. I wrote it in. It was this membrane right there. Okay, that is the septum pellucidum there, as well as over here. Okay, I'm sure you've heard of CTE before. And people that have CTE, sometimes that can be so damaged that there's holes and it makes it look like Swiss cheese. In fact, let me see if I can pull it up. I have a picture. I guess I didn't have the right one open. Maybe it didn't. I guess I thought it did. I guess I don't. Maybe I'll see if I can find it and show it to you guys. But it's pretty wild how much that can be damaged. If you've ever heard of Aaron Hernandez, which was the football player from the Patriots that ended up going to jail for murder. Not that CTE caused it, but they looked at his brain after he had committed suicide, and among a lot of things, that septum pellucidum was just like nothing anymore. His brain was so beaten, nothing. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so those are the two lateral ventricles. The third ventricle, literally is named third ventricle, is a thin vertical space below and medial to the lateral ventricles. It is superior to the hypothalamus in between the right and left halves of the thalamus. Okay, that's this one shaded kind of in the light blue, kind of just below the major parts of the two lateral ventricles. Can't see it here, but that's what this one would be right here. Now, keep in mind, the fluid, as I've mentioned, in your brain isn't going to just stay in these chambers. It's going to flow from chamber to chamber. So there's two tubes that connect your two lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. We can see one of them is labeled here, very short, small tube, and that's called the interventricular foramen. Now, above here, where I've got it listed, I have it as interventricular foramina, and that's because the word foramina is plural, and that's because there's two of them. Okay, and that's because you've got one coming from each lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. So there's two lateral ventricles, two of these carrying the cerebrospinal fluid to the third ventricle. Okay. The fourth ventricle is a diamond-shaped chamber in front of the cerebellum and posterior to the pons. So it's in between those two structures, and then it narrows caudally to become the central canal, that cerebrospinal fluid filled space in the middle of your spinal cord. Okay, that was what we labeled here in this illustration on our picture from the first page. Okay, so your fourth ventricle lies between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Now, how does the fluid get from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle? There's a tube, and that's another thing that we labeled. It was this tube right here that splits the midbrain in half, what we call the cerebral aqueduct, or also goes by aqueduct of the midbrain. I want you to know it both ways, and that's why I wrote it down both ways on that first page. Okay, so illustration over here on the right just shows how the fluid is going to flow. Okay, from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle through those interventricular foramina, then to the fourth ventricle thanks to the aqueduct or of the midbrain or cerebral aqueduct. From there, fluid can flow into the subarachnoid space thanks to those choroid plexuses to then return to the sinuses, which then returns that fluid back to the blood. Okay. But in many cases, that fluid also is just going to flow from the fourth ventricle down into the central canal of your spinal cord. Okay. Now, how do we form cerebrospinal fluid? Well, we do it through the structures known as choroid plexuses, which we have inside of all of these different ventricles. Okay. Choroid plexuses are networks of blood capillaries in the walls of our ventricles, which allow selected substances, and it's mainly water, from our blood plasma to be filtered from the capillaries and then secreted by the epithelial cells to produce cerebrospinal fluid. This illustration here, actually, we can see choroid plexus, and then there's zooming in and showing you what it would look like. Okay. In red is the blood vessel. Surrounding it are the ependymal cells, which take the fluid from the blood and secrete out the cerebrospinal fluid, which would then accumulate in the chambers. And keep in mind, we're always doing this because as we return cerebrospinal fluid back to the blood, we'd eventually run out if we weren't continuously resupplying it. Okay. So that's what's happening. As far as this image goes, I've already kind of told you what you need to highlight, but if you didn't miss it or you missed something, here are what you need to have. Fourth ventricle, don't worry about the lateral or the median aperture. The central canal, and then on the right, these four things that are capitalized for you: lateral ventricles, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, aqueduct, the midbrain, or cerebral aqueduct. As far as any other pictures, this one or the two at the bottom, don't worry about those. All right, now the fun really begins. We've got that kind of introductory stuff out of the way. You can actually start learning about the different parts of your brain, what they do, and their kind of intricate anatomy. For those of you who are in physiology, you got to hear a lot of this stuff just a few weeks ago. So it'll be a nice review for you, but that's okay. All right, just the two blinks there at the top. All right, we're gonna, like I said, start at the bottom of the brain, work our way up to the top, beginning with what we call the medulla oblongata, about 3 centimeters in length, which is right about an inch, a little bit longer than an inch. Superficially looks just like an extension of the spinal cord, but is slightly wider. You know, if you look at this previous page, here's the spinal cord, here's the medulla. Not much difference, just a little bit fatter towards the front, projects a little bit more anteriorly. Not nearly as much as the pons, but it is a little bit fatter than the spinal cord. Okay. It begins at the foramen magnum. Remember, that's the big hole at the base of your skull and extends to the inferior border of your pons. Okay. Within the medulla is white matter containing all sensory or ascending and motor or descending tracts ascending between the spinal cord and other parts of the brain. In other words, any signal going up and down between your brain and your spinal cord has to travel through the pons. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense because, you know, here's your spinal cord, or here would be your spinal cord, here will be your medulla. Okay. There's no way to get from here to here without going first through the medulla. Okay. Now, some of the white matter of your medulla has these special bulges on the anterior side, or form these special bulges known as pyramids. Okay, and they're formed by large corticospinal tracts passing from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. Now, why this is important? Because these tracts control voluntary movement of your limbs and your trunk. So in other words, pyramids are carrying the signals from your brain that cause your muscles in your arms and your legs and your trunk to contract. So when you wave your arms, signals are coming through your pyramids and your medulla. Now, something special takes place thanks to these pyramids, which you can see here in the brain view, in the inferior view of the brain. But this is the image that really shows what really takes place. Look what happens to these pyramids. They crisscross and they literally create the letter X. We call this decussation, okay, or crossing over, and it's gonna explain why each side of your brain controls voluntary movements on the opposite sides of the body. So in other words, if you've never learned this before, your left brain controls the right side of your body, your right brain controls the left side of your body. This is why. Now, not all signals, about 90% of the axons in the left pyramid cross the right, 90% from the right to the left, but the majority of those signals are crossing over thanks to these pyramids. Okay. Other important aspects of your medulla include the nuclei that control several visceral and somatic functions. These 3 bullets especially tell you some of the most important things that your medulla does. Your medulla can be described as a major regulator of your entire cardiovascular system, which we haven't talked about the cardiovascular system yet, but we will here in just a few short weeks. Your cardiovascular system includes your heart, it includes your blood vessels that connect to your heart, and then includes the blood inside. Okay. Well, your medulla regulates your heart. The cardiac center is the part of medulla that regulates the rate and the force of each heartbeat. So in other words, it controls how fast your heart's beating and how forcefully, how strong or how weakly it beats. Okay. The vasomotor center of your medulla adjusts your blood vessels diameter. Okay, and this is going to help regulate your blood pressure. It can help reroute blood from one part of the body to another. So your medulla controls your heart rate, it controls your blood pressure, it controls where the blood flows. So that's why I say it's the major regulator of your entire cardiovascular system. Okay. Within the medulla, we also have what we call the medullary respiratory or rhythmicity area. And this is part of our brain that adjusts your breathing rate. So it controls how often you breathe, like at rest, not a whole lot, like 12 breaths a minute, but like when you're vigorously exercising, you breathe a lot more often. and it's because of your medulla. Okay, so obviously these three bullets, very, very important things. I mean, we can't do anything if we're not breathing and our heart's not pumping, because we're going to die pretty shortly. Okay, not nearly as important, but still play very important roles in their own right. Will be reflexes, courtesy of your medulla, that regulate things like vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. Okay. Your medulla contains nuclei, which we've seen that word nucleus and nuclei before. Remember, at the end of our nervous tissue lecture, we said nucleus is a collection of several neuronal cell bodies in the CNS. So in this case, what you have are a whole bunch of things like the vagus nucleus, hypoglossal nucleus that you see there. Those would be where you'd find a whole bunch of cell bodies of neurons. Okay. But these nuclei are components of the sensory pathways for gestation, which is a fancy word for taste, audition, which is a fancy word for hearing, equilibrium, which is a fancy word for balance. Okay, literally those nuclei are called the gustatory nucleus, cochlear nuclei, and vestibular nuclei. The medulla also contains nuclei associated with some non-special senses. Okay, we have 5 special senses: taste, hearing, equilibrium are 3 of them. The others would be smell and vision. Okay, but then you've got non-specialized senses, what we call diurnal senses, like touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception. Okay, the nuclei associated with those include the gracile nucleus, cuneate nucleus. Okay, and then actually you can see here connected to your medulla are some of our cranial nerves. Cranial nerves always have a special name, and they also have a Roman numeral. Okay, cranial nerves 8, which is VII, would be the vestibulocochlear nerves. IX is 9, glossopharyngeal. X is the vagus. XI is 11, that's accessory. XII, that's 12, hypoglossal. That's the stuff that you see that's colored gold. Okay, in the case of the medulla, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs connect to it, and the medulla is associated with those nerves. We can see some of those, like the vagus nerve labeled right there. As far as these 2 images go, you don't need to worry about them. It's really kind of too tough to tell things apart. This one especially, it's kind of intricate, but do want to make sure you know the stuff at the top. Right now. All right, moving on. I guess I could say moving up, because that's what we're doing, crawling up the brain. All right, your pons is a anterior bulge in the brainstem superior to the medulla. Can be described as basically a bridge, which is literally what the term pons means, and that's because it's like a bridge. It connects different parts of the brain with one another. It includes white matter that has tracks conducting signals from the cerebrum down to the cerebellum and medulla, tracks that carry signals up to the thalamus. So in other words, you know, I've kind of mentioned this with the medulla, for example, signals can't just skip from the spinal cord up to the cerebrum. They can't skip from the medulla up to the cerebrum or down from the cerebrum to the medulla. They also have to pass through the pons. Okay? So it's got white matter that connects it with other parts of the brain. Pons also consists of nuclei, sensory tracts, and motor tracts. Okay, so what does it do? It integrates autonomic reflexes mediated by the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. I didn't list off their special names. That's okay. We'll see them at the end of the lecture. Okay, but here's that same image from the previous page. You can see the pons very nicely. You can see some of those cranial nerves, the golden yellow shaded nerves connected to it, just like there were to the medulla. This second bullet here, this is something that I would definitely put a star or highlight. That's probably, in my opinion, if not the most important thing that your PONS does. It's really high up there. Along with the medulla and that medullary rhythmicity area that we just talked about, within the PONS, we have what we call the pneumotaxic and apneusic areas that help control our breathing. Okay? And I'm not going to get into detail about what they do as far as, when I say help control and breathing, what does that mean? I'm just going to leave it at that. It's very technical. I'll get into that for you in phys. But I'm not going to do that in this class. It's too physiology based stuff. But just know pneumotaxic areas, pneumotaxic and apneusic areas help the medulla with controlling our breathing. Okay. PONS contains vestibular nuclei, which are components of the equilibrium pathway from your inner ear to the brain. So they're going to play a role in balance or equilibrium. And then signals for voluntary movements for motor areas of the cerebral cortex are relayed through nuclei in the PONS to the cerebellum. Okay, above your PONS is the midbrain, also goes by the term mesencephalon, although you'll never hear me call it that. I just go by midbrain. Short segment of the brain stem connects the PONS to the diencephalon. We've already talked about this, but the aqueduct of the midbrain or cerebral aqueduct passes through it. Associated with the midbrain are the following functions. Anterior part of the midbrain contains paired bundles of axons called cerebral peduncles. These are axons of motor tracts conducting nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, pons, and medulla. So kind of the same situation. If I go back to the image, signals coming up and down between the brain and the other parts of your central nervous system. Not only do they have to pass through the medulla and the pons, they also have to pass through the midbrain. Okay. One of the coolest things that your midbrain does is helps us be consciously aware of the sensation of pain, which, I'm going to say this and it's going to sound really weird, but pain's a fantastic thing that we experience. And I say that because although it sucks to feel pain, it tells us that something's wrong. Okay? If you couldn't feel pain, how awful would it be if you put your hand on the stove and you weren't aware that it was on fire? Okay. Or if you had a nail sticking in your leg or something like that. So your midbrain, very important for that. A lot of what your midbrain does is associated with vision and hearing. Okay. It functions in visual attention. So being able to focus in on something that you see, to track something that's moving, something that's very important, like if you're playing catch or if you're just going for a drive and you have to make sure you stay on the road. Other visual things like reflexes of blinking, focusing, dilating, constricting your pupils, turning your eyes and head in response to a visual stimulus. When it comes to hearing, it's associated with reflexes like the startle reflex. That can cause your head, your eyes, and trunk to move when you're hearing a loud noise like a gunshot. It's a protective mechanism. That way, if it's a loud noise that's dangerous to you, you're crouching, you're getting protected. You're looking at it so you can see if something's coming at you. Within the midbrain are several nuclei, one of which is known as the substantia nigra, which is actually shown right here in our transverse sections. It's kind of, maroonish shaded color. It releases a chemical called dopamine involved in subconsciously controlling our body movements. Unfortunately, it's a loss of the neurons from the substantia nigra that can lead to what's called Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, if you're not familiar with it, is a progressive disorder of the central nervous system. Typically affects victims around age 60, but people that suffer from Parkinson's eventually end up having involuntary skeletal muscle contractions, interfering with voluntary movements. So in other words, what happens is people just are involuntarily contracting their muscles and they can't stop it. So they're doing things with their hands, their feet, they're fidgeting all the time and they just can't relax. And it's very debilitating because, they just can't settle those emotions down. They know what causes it. There's no way to prevent it. There's no real good treatment for it. I mean, there's things they do to manage it, but it's not curable, unfortunately. And it really sucks for those people. If you're familiar with Michael J. Fox, he is probably the most well-known person that suffers from it. He was like 40 when he was diagnosed, and it kind of ruined his acting career, but he's made a comeback, which is fantastic. Other things associated with the midbrain include red nuclei. You can see red nucleus is labeled here. If they were labeling both, it'd be nuclei. Those are sites of synapses between axons from the cerebellum and cerebral cortex to help control some voluntary movement of limbs. And then just like with the previous couple structures associated with the midbrain are cranial nerves, in this case 3 and 4, which I also didn't list their real names, but that's okay. As far as these pictures go, you know, it's kind of cool to see some of these things, but I'm not going to really worry about you knowing them for the exam. Too many real technical, tricky images you'll see, but that's okay. All right, I'm going to stop here. We'll start with the reticular formation on Thursday. You can kind of tell we're going to be able to buzz through this lecture pretty quick as we kind of just run through what the different parts of the brain do. So I imagine we'll be able to finish this up in about an hour on Thursday, and then move on into unit 5. All right.